Hey everybody, it's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Welcome to what is a sunny day in my bedroom. I'm really thrilled that y'all are with us for the latest in what we're starting to wind down V+. I think this is our third to last gathering of the group that we have together, and you're in for a really good one. We have, as I'm sure you know, because you signed up for it and you're joining us now, a tremendous number of really great folks who are going to talk to us about something that a lot of us end up doing quite a bit, which is trying to communicate really vital, fresh information and research to people in a wide range of capacities, whether they're policymakers, whether they're academics, any number of different folks who may have use of research that frankly sometimes shows up and feels a little bit dense, maybe a little bit obtuse. The value of it is not immediately apparent. So it's our job to be sort of those simultaneous translators and put it into, imagine this, plain English. So we're going to talk about how you do that, and also how you actually build the strategies and plans to not only build in that buy-in internally, make sure you get to the outcomes you're really after. So that's what we're going to give to you over the next hour. But before we do that, we're going to do what we usually do when we gather together. And that's, we're going to start with just a 2-word check-in. So if you would, go ahead and wander on down to the bottom of your screen with your cursor or your finger, whatever you use to manipulate the computer. And if you would, go ahead into the chat function. You should see that looks like a word cloud. Crack that open. And make sure you're talking, probably says you're talking to everyone, or it might say all panelists and attendees. And if you would, not include Alice and Marianne, everybody else who's presenting, to join us here, Jennifer and Emily as well. Let's just go in and just in 2 words, your name, where you're coming in from, and then the 2 words, how you doing today? Are you okay? Let us know. So part of our purpose here is we've gathered over these last several months is to be in community with one another. And one way to do that, to support one another, is just to be honest. How we doing? And Marianne's already jumped in, as I'll welcome other folks. Allison coming in from North in Chicago. I know that because I just saw you a second ago. Who else we got here? Jennifer in North Carolina, Mara in Chicago, Simone up in Boston. How you doing, my friend? Sabrina in DC. Strangely good. Yes, Sabrina, I hope you're getting outside. It's, as you can see, bright and sunny in my part of the neighborhood in DC. Emily in Jersey City, grateful for some sunshine. Yeah, for all of us, I think, especially after the last couple of days, many of us seeing some snow in certain parts of the country. And Lenore, nice to see you. Bobby, how are you out in LA? Glad to have you with us. Imagine you're tired. You guys have been through a lot. All right, so continue to be, I can't keep up with y'all because you're getting after it now, which is awesome. So if you would, just continue to be in conversation with one another. We're also gonna be tossing some links in here over the course of the next little while. But as we always do, just keep chatting with one another. As we always do, my partner in crime, Tristan Mahabir, is behind the scenes, and he's manipulating the slide deck. So T, if you would, just go ahead and take it forward to the next one. And that's just to tell you something you already know, which is all the things that we've created together, basically going back into September, are available online. Now all of V is available on YouTube. I think the one exception is Nicole Handel-Jones's session. She asked us to make that exclusive to V, so we don't have a replay of that, but everything else that we did is up on YouTube, and all the things we've done at V+ for now, still behind a password. You can get to it right there, ComNetworkVirtual.org, and it'll remain there for a little while. Imagine sometime in the early part of next year, we'll make all of this available, because at the end of the day, our purpose is to make sure we get all the information we can out to as many people as possible so it can do as much good as it can. And so with that, Mr. T, if you would, carry us forward. To let you know a couple things we've got coming up. First one is Kevin Wynn. He was one of the forces behind creating Creative Mornings, which means he knows an awful lot about building community and building creative communities. I think we're kind of all creative on some level, right? The communications business. He's going to be joining us to talk about why community is so darn important and why it's essential, if you work in the communication space, to think of yourself as a community builder. We've been saying for a while now that communication moves at the speed of trust, and you trust folks you know. So your communities are increasingly essential, particularly now. It's a lesson I think we've all learned across this year. So with that, Kevin will be with us just in a couple of weeks' time, or a week's time. Mr. T, if you would, take us forward. And then super excited about this, Sarah King, Dr. Sarah King, who until fairly recently was an academic teaching communications at UCLA. She's got an incredible background, but she's going to talk to us about the role of community and the brain science behind social justice. There's actually a lot going on in your head when you're thinking about issues and advocacy. She's going to help us tap into that, along with a couple of exercises to help us actually get in touch with the social justice aspects of your brain. Let's go ahead to the next one, Mr. T, and that'll close us out for V+. And now you get to stop hearing me yak at you. I'll show up again in the chat along the way, and I'll be back towards the end. But for now, let's go ahead and pass it off. Marianne, I think we're going to start with a poll. But you'll see we struck the word there, communicating research, not disseminating. That's a little bit too big of a word. We're gonna try to avoid as many $50 words as we can and go with just good, plain, old-fashioned English, right? So suffice to say, let's get into it. Marianne, if you want to take us away, and we'll have a poll for everybody, so get ready to respond in just a quick minute. Oh, Marianne can't hear you yet, friend. There you go.
Thank you, Sean. Hello, I'm Marianne McMullen. I'm the Director of Communication and Dissemination at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. We want to do a few poll questions at the top here so that we can get to know you and be responsive to who this audience is right here. So Tristan, if you could get our first poll question up, it's how frequently do you communicate about research? So take a minute, everybody, and answer that one. In the meantime, with my fellow panelists, I want to welcome you today to this panel on communicating about research. We'll be conducting this session in an interview format and then move to questions and discussions. I will introduce each panelist as I ask them a question. In the world of communication, good research is currency. Journalists need credible sources to cite, and policymakers need evidence they can trust when making decisions. But communicating about research has its own unique set of challenges, and it's those challenges that we're going to address together in the next hour. So there's our poll results. Okay, so of the people attending this session, well, we've got about 46 people. You communicate about research a lot. So weekly, monthly, at least half of you are communicating at least monthly about research. Thank you. So as we present tips about research and communication, we're going to move forward in this presentation from the evidence base for communicating about research and the importance of building trust, to effective planning, to crafting messages, to engaging audiences. So that's kind of the four-step path that we plan on taking you through today. But let's continue to get to know you a little bit better. Let's go with the second poll question, if we can, Tristan. And the second question is, if your role is in communications, where do you work? And there's some options for you. While you're answering that, I just wanted to let you know that we've also prepared a tip sheet takeaway for you. As we've been planning this session, we've come up with a lot of different tips and learned a lot from each other, and we want to share that learning with you. So that will be available to you after the session. So do we have results on that one? Oh, look at that. A third of you work for nonprofit or advocacy organizations, and nearly a third for foundations. And only a relatively small percentage in university and academic institutions. So you are funding research, you are advocacy organizations, and a lot of independent communication consultants. Excellent, thank you so much. So to kick off the panel, I'm going to start with Lenore Nyer, the communications manager at William T. Grant Foundation. W.T. Grant funds social science research to improve the lives of young people and has been at the forefront of thinking about how social science research can influence policy. Lenore, can you give us a high-level description of how evidence informs research communication, as well as tell us what you found out from your own survey of grantees on this topic?
I'd be happy to do that, Marianne. It's wonderful to be here. And as Marianne said, we fund social science research to improve outcomes for young people. Now, researchers often enter the field because they believe that research findings can and should make a difference in the world. But how do they get those findings into the hands of people who can use them? Well, for the last 12 years, the William T. Grant Foundation has been funding research on understanding and improving the use of research evidence in policy and practice. And what have we learned from more than 70 rigorous, high-quality studies? That dissemination alone is not enough to get research used. It implies a one-way street. All you have to do is push the findings out in order to have them used. But convincing evidence exists that research use requires attention to engagement between researchers, decision makers, and the intermediaries between them, which includes the media. There's an emerging body of evidence featuring the social side of evidence use. Relationships and trust are the pathways by which policymakers and practitioners acquire research, evaluate its trustworthiness, and consider its use. Now, all of these findings were supported by grantees that I interviewed to learn more about their outreach activities. What I heard was that developing strong relationships was the bedrock upon which everything else evolved. Moreover, grantees reported that the informal relationships that they developed were the most impactful. Informal presentations and briefings, as well as the availability to answer policymaker, practitioner, and journalist questions builds trust. Grantees reported that these two-way streets not only build the trust, but are crucial if the researcher is to be at the table with the decision maker as they think through and develop policies. Now, raising the visibility of research findings through the media has a crucial role to play. And for example, one of our grantees that I interviewed said it was a great way to broadcast my findings more broadly and reach people I wouldn't normally have access to. As a result of the media, I'm on the Rolodex of journalists and have been contacted by influential advocacy groups. Another said high quality journalists who can translate research to a broader audience can help make a bigger impact and reach more people. It encourages legislators to consider an issue that they didn't think was important or hadn't been aware of. So what's the takeaway from all of this? We can develop relationships with researchers built on mutuality, respect, and trust, and in turn help them develop relationships with journalists and or decision makers. Because research evidence demonstrates that this can lead to collaborations, partnerships, increased respect for and understanding of the research evidence, and in some cases directly influence policy. And at that, I'm going to kick it back to you, Marianne.
Thank you so much, Lenore. Next, we're going to talk about effective planning to get to some of the engagement that Lenore is talking about. But let's do one more quick poll question so that we can be sure to address issues that are of greatest concern to you as we proceed. So, Tristan, if we can go to question 3. In your work communicating about research, what are your biggest pain points? This one takes a second to read. All right, everybody get a chance to identify pain points. This also is what brought up a lot of discussion among the panelists. Okay, still some votes coming in. All right. Okay, translating findings into plain language or actionable implications. There's so much going back and forth between researchers and communicators when you're engaged in this. But we also have a lot of creating an effective impact strategy. We're going to talk about that right now. How to measure the impact of communications. We can address that toward the end. Okay, and you've got good leadership support, it looks like. That's wonderful. Thank you all so much. So, engagement and relationships are important in getting the research into the right hands and used by practitioners and policymakers. But let's back it up to the very beginning of the process. Jennifer Clark is a communications consultant based in North Carolina, and she has put a lot of thought into building trust between communicators and researchers. Jennifer, can you talk to us a bit about the process by which communicators can build that trust? Thank you, Tristan.
Yes, thanks, Marianne. And, thanks ComNet for hosting a session on this topic. It's one of my favorites to discuss, or commiserate on is probably the better term for it. Well, it seemed like a lot of you didn't really need a lot of help building trust with researchers. So you may have you may have learned some things that I didn't learn for many years. But before I became an independent consultant, I was the director of communications at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, where I led a fairly small team. We were just 2 or 3 people at the time, and we released over 100 publications a year. And now that I'm consulting, I'm an even smaller team of just one. So building trust with researchers is, I think, important for anyone who communicates research. But for those who may be the lone comms voice in a room, I think it's especially important. And my first tip to building that trust is just to recognize that every time a researcher hands their work off to you, they are placing their reputation in your hands. To them, you aren't just writing a press release or sending a tweet, you're shaping how the world sees their life's work and how their peers evaluate their contributions to the field. So, you'd be wary too. But it took many heated discussions and track changes and comments on Word documents before I actually figured this out. But when I did, it allowed me to more effectively work with them. And also I was able to offer better messaging solutions. So it made me a better communicator. Over time, they began to trust that I didn't just want to make them look dumb or that I was quote unquote dumbing down their work, which I'm sure some of you have heard many times before. But they realized that I wanted to help their work be understood and have an impact. And that's what they want too. But they also want to be able to show their face at the next American Sociological Association conference or something, whatever it is. But by understanding this, you can help them do both. So my second tip is that, and this may be obvious, but take an interest in the details of their work. I know communicators have a lot to juggle, but if you're able to carve out more time to ask those detailed questions about the nuances of their data analysis or about their broader field of research, I think the time that you invest can really pay off. I found that it not only opens up lines of communication, but it also has really made me better at what I do. Sometimes digging into the nuances of the methodology helped me figure out the most effective way to communicate something to a non-expert audience crucially, without losing the integrity of the research. And then my last tip is my absolute favorite one, which is show your work. Researchers are trained to trust the evidence. And to get buy-in for your communication strategies, just beat them at their own game. Gather your evidence and share your analysis and insights with them on a regular basis. For instance, did this 100-page report with 30 data tables and absolutely no charts and figures flop? Or did this series of 4 shorter reports with engaging figures get more reach? This is your opportunity to prove that you were right. And showing them cold, hard evidence makes it easier to gain their buy-in for next time. There are many tools and resources for tracking and analyzing comms metrics, which I won't get into here, but if any of you have any favorite ones, just definitely drop those in the chat, because I know I would like to know about them, and I'm sure other people would too. And each organization is different, and I think probably the metrics that are most meaningful to you will be different also. So my advice is just to identify a reasonable number of metrics like web visits or social media shares that you can track regularly over time, and have a process for sharing that with the research team at regular intervals, if it's at a quarterly meeting or a staff meeting or whatever it is. So to recap, I'd say my top tips for building trust with researchers are: 1, remember that their reputation is in your hands; 2, sweat the details and learn about the nuances of their work; and 3, gather your evidence for how comms can help research make an impact. So those are my tips, and I'll send it back over to Mary Ann.
Terrific. Thank you, Jennifer. And Jennifer is in a lot of ways responsible for this session because a few of us attended her session together in Austin. I think Lenore, you and I were sitting at the same table, and that's where we actually started talking about, we need to do a session just on communicating about research. So thank you, Jennifer. On the planning front, I want to quickly show you an example of a detailed rollout plan that you can develop as a first step to having conversations that build trust, as well as being very strategic about how to get your research out into the field. It starts with sitting down with researchers, and it helps to have a set list of what all you need to develop. So you can go to the next slide, Tristan, and then I am going to share my screen. Okay, so what you should be seeing now is a rollout plan. And this is for a report we recently released, COVID-19 and child welfare. We were doing releasing original research on the impact of COVID-19 on child welfare systems and on child maltreatment reporting. So for me, having this rollout team, everybody who's involved, every time you need to send an email or talk to people, the names are right there, because I might be working with 4 different teams at any point on a coming rollout. And so this has our own staff, our funder, Casey Family Programs, their PR firm, which is always nice to have that little extra help when you're working on a rollout. The title of the report, so it's handy. Work very closely with the researchers on the top line message. This starts with cutting and pasting the top findings from the report and some of the summary information, and then you go through the hard work of translating, because often what is in the report is not good for public communication. It's just too dense. It has too much lingo. It has acronyms, all sorts of things that you really work on getting this top line message together. And once you have that in your key findings, it's all in one collective place. Everybody can see it. Everybody can get to it. You can use it for shaping your cover notes to the media, for doing your social media posts, any kind of communication to leadership. Hey, this just came out. So having that one spot where you have your messages, your recommendations, how systems can make adaptive changes. Then your visuals. Again, these are pulled right from the report, the first ones. So these are things you could use in social media or other communication. And then we let our graphic designer to the same data. And then the graphic designer produces something a little more user-friendly that we can use, particularly in social media. Again, that's all in one place. So if everybody's, oh, where's that graphic? I want to throw it in a tweet. They know where it is. It's all in one document. Key goals and audiences. Now for us, we have 4 key audiences that's part of who we regularly communicate to: policymakers, funders, implementers, and knowledge developers, which is other researchers. So rarely do we come up with an audience that we want to talk to that doesn't fit under one of these 4 categories. So we just sit there with the researchers and say, okay, which policymakers? Are we talking about federal committees of jurisdiction? Are we talking about which states are like, is California cutting edge on some child welfare policies? Let's make sure we get to the right people in the California legislature. Permissions. This is something very unique to research. You have IRB permissions. You have the permission of each data source that you're using. It's so important to make sure everyone has signed off. If you have a federal contract, they often need 30 days. Federal agencies need 30 days to review what you've done. Then targeted media. This is the fun part where you start talking about, well, this journalist has done this story, that journalist has done this story, they might be interested in this, and you write them all down. And as you can see, I track who I reached out to and when, so that I don't forget what I've done. Social media plan, come up with a social media kit, completed and reviewed. And even though you do it based on the language, you end up getting a little more creative with social media. So you want the researchers to review that again. Very important list here, your schedule of deliverables based on all the conversations recorded above. Here's all the things you're going to produce, or that you've decided you're going to produce, and here's who's doing it and what the status of it, again, tracking. I probably wouldn't be so thorough at planning if I had a better memory. I don't have a good memory, so this is my memory. And then finally, your schedule of rollout activities. This is what you do on each day. Your whole team can go in and say, oh, it's Tuesday, 5 a.m. I need to be doing X, so that you can keep track of who, and often there's a lot of it. This one actually wasn't very complicated. There's advanced calls because there's people you want to know about the research before it comes out. So sometimes this could be 7 days of activities. And then finally, rollout reports, hitting on some of the metrics that Jen was talking about. We do a thorough report on how it's doing, 72 hours, and then we do another one 1 week out, and it goes over all the usual page hits, downloads, social media responses, and clippings are also included in that report. So that's a little bit about how Chapin Hall does the planning, and I will stop sharing my screen. And we'll go ahead to the next slide, Tristan. So also on the planning front, but moving into messaging, you can work with more than just researchers and communicators. You can expand your planning team to other partners, including advocates. Emily Crone Phillips is the communication director for the Spencer Foundation. Emily, can you talk to us a little bit about partnerships and how they can impact both planning and messaging?
Sure, thanks, Marianne. Hi, everyone. It's fun to see some familiar names on the chat. I am going to talk a little bit about today some of my experiences in my past professional life, which was at the Consortium on Chicago School Research at the University of Chicago, which produced education research for the improvement of Chicago public schools. And what I'm going to talk about is the different roles that partnerships can play, because they really can play a lot of different roles. And in fact, the roles that they play can speak to a lot of the challenges that we've been talking about today already. I've used partnerships as validators, partners as validators. I've used partners as intellectual partners for the research. And I've used partnerships as basically a built-in network. So I'm going to go through those three different things, and there's different ways to use partners, but those are the three that I kind of wanted to focus on today. So when I talk about a validator, I am really talking about somebody who could serve as a validator, sometimes a spokesperson, sometimes I call it a translator. It basically means they're willing to say some of the things that you hope they will say when they're called about the research. So sometimes it just means talking with people ahead of time who are the people who are likely to be called by the media to ensure that they have a heads up about what's in the report and are willing to give it a thumbs up. Sometimes that means that they're willing to say the kinds of things that people will understand if they don't have a PhD, so get to cut through the jargon. And sometimes it means that they're actually willing to go a little bit farther with the implications than maybe the researchers themselves are. And I noticed in the chat, there was a question about how do you convince researchers to sacrifice a little bit of the precision, and how do you convince them to go a little bit farther with the implications of their research. And the truth is sometimes you just can't, and they won't. But sometimes if you get a partnership right, that's who can be the people who are going to move the implications forward, who are going to move the research in a way that the researchers just can't, because it's either it goes beyond what they think the research says, or because they don't want to be pigeonholed as an advocate. One of the times that a validator is particularly important is when something's going to be really controversial. And a lot of times when you are releasing a report, the big danger is that somebody's going to pick a little piece of it up and blow it up into something that you didn't want it to be, that you don't even agree with those implications. And so part of this is about getting people on board around your messages ahead of time. I'll give you an example. When I was in Chicago, we were putting out a report about school closings. And if you live in Chicago or follow education, you know that that's one of the most painful and just controversial things that a school district can do. And we were putting out a report that was designed to really give people actionable evidence to help them move forward after this mass school closure in Chicago. And we were really worried because we had partnerships with both the Chicago Public Schools and a lot of the community groups who had strongly opposed the actions of the Chicago Public Schools. And so what we did was we worked for months ahead of time with different community groups, with Chicago Public Schools, to help them understand the implications of the research. And not surprisingly, the research had things that both sides liked and things that both sides really, really did not like. And through this long process, we were able to get to the point where neither side torpedoed the research when it came out. Both were willing to speak to the parts of it that they particularly agreed with. And the story became about how to sort of learn from what had happened in Chicago rather than about a shouting match about whether or not it was good research. And so I think that's sort of really always what you're aiming for. The other two things that you can use partnerships for are as intellectual partners, people who sometimes will bring knowledge to the work that isn't about the research, but brings great insight. We partnered, for example, with a group that was very knowledgeable about attendance. We were supposed to be working with the mayor's office around attendance because we had found we had done a research report about just how important preschool attendance was. And the mayor's office was like, let's have pizza parties to encourage attendance. And we were like, no, what a horrible idea. And luckily we had this really awesome partner that had been working very deeply with school districts, and they were able to say, well, pizza parties are like a really nice idea, but maybe also we should talk about chronic asthma as one of the reasons. And, and they were able to get like really deep intellectually into the real issues there in a way that as researchers, we just didn't really know what all of the different issues were behind some of the findings that we had. And then the other way to use partners are just as, incredible networking opportunities. One of the pain points that a lot of people talked about or mentioned was just not having the resources to be able to have the kind of impact you want. If you work with partners, they might have the resources, they might have the networks that you lack, the kind of relationships that Lenore spoke about in the beginning. It's very hard at scale to build those kinds of relationships, but if you can build a partnership with other people who have those relationships, that's another good way to get your research out there. So I'll end there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Emily. Partnerships are so important, more important than in research than I think in any other thing I've worked on communications for. Okay, Tristan, next slide, please. So continuing a focus on messaging, Jennifer Amder Spitz is a communication consultant based in Chicago, and she's done some excellent work combining storytelling with sharing data. Jennifer, can you tell us about the importance of storytelling with research results and show us what that can look like?
Sure. Thanks, Marianne. Thanks for hosting this wonderful session. We've had a great time planning it. And I've been working on mission-driven communication strategies across many different issue areas for my whole career. So research is always an important part of most communication strategies, because it really tells us and helps to define a problem. And it also helps us understand whether we're solving that problem. So, there's the summative research where you release a big study, and then there's also incremental research, and there's stories to tell all along the way. So what I look at is it's the data that tells us what we should be paying attention to. And it's the storytelling that lets us relate to that data and makes it real, helps us encourage people to care about it, helps people see what kind of impact it can make in the world. So really by putting like that data and storytelling together, that's what we need to do as communicators. I mean, not just to get the general public and the news media to care about a story, but even, presenting it at conferences and to peers, everybody relates better to stories. So I'm gonna tell a little bit of a story about one of our projects. And so I'm going to take over the screen here. And okay, you guys seeing my screen? Yes, great. Okay, so this is a project that we worked on, and this is, kind of brings things together. This is a town of Depew, Illinois. It's a environmental catastrophe. There's data showing that there's contamination from closed industry. It's 950 acres, and
excuse me, Jennifer. I think you're not showing us the website.
Oh, thank you. How about now? All right. Okay. So this illustrates the importance of bringing partners together. So Depew, Illinois is this environmental catastrophe. It's the 14th largest Superfund site, and it's in the middle of a town. And for 16 years, they had evidence and upon evidence and of the contaminants there, and nothing was being done. So Northwestern Law School was representing the town. The Northwestern Chemistry Department helped put together this data, and we created a map. So we have a video here that kind of tells the history of the town. You can take a tour of the town and see the different contamination sites. Each one has a little video. It'll show you around the town. And then we took the data and we put it on a map. So this is where all of that data that had been accumulating and the research that showed that there's all of these issues becomes real for people. So these are all of the different samples in this town, and you can just kind of see this beautiful town is along a river in Illinois. And if you want to dive into here, you can just click on any one of these and see what is in that sample. And then you can view the contamination details and expand the raw data. And it'll show you what the levels are. And you can even, click on them and it'll open up and tell you what the impact of that is on the human body. So after 16 years, this town, we started to get some momentum, got a lot of media coverage, and then we're able to give people a way to access this that made it real to them, because there's people in the town who are telling their stories. We then, working with the chemistry department at Northwestern University, they created, this is going back to those partnerships. How do you deputize people? How do you get more people engaged and to care about your issue? So we created a curriculum using the map, and what students can do is go to this virtual map and they can choose a location, find the schools, and then create their own map of how much contamination a person would get if they lived in that town and went to school every day. So that starts to make it real for the students in the town. And then what that does is they start to own that, and you have these conversations in classrooms about the contamination and about the data. And I can show you a little bit of this is the end of a video. This is a little summary video about this citizen scientist, National Science Foundation funded project to help students use this data across the country. And
so let's talk about all of the things as citizens we can do. We've talked about letters to the editor, social media, letters to legislators.
This whole project is about teaching students that science is not just a bunch of boring facts in a textbook, but has real-world applications.
They'll remember the chemistry that they're doing better than they'll ever remember reading it out of a book or listening to me lecture about it. This has been a real good experience, and we're definitely going to do it again.
So with all of these different partners and all of these students doing this little project within their own schools, what happens is then they start writing those letters to the editor, and we get some more voices advocating for this issue. So, this is just from this spring, and now the Superfund site is starting to get cleaned up. They remediated all of the soil in the residents' backyards last year, and that was a huge project. And now they're going into one of the operating areas. So this kind of is a full circle story of how the data and, they're continuing to take soil samples and water samples to show the magnitude of the problem, but we can also see that it's getting solved. And we can also see that the social impact of making that visible, making the study visible, can start to generate real results.
That's fantastic, Jennifer. And it's so great to see video, which I know you specialize in, brought in as another communication tool about research. So Kristen, we can go to the next question slide. So now I want to bring it back, speaking full circle, to the engagement aspect that Lenore first talked about when we are circulating research. Allison Gross is the Director of Strategic Communication and External Affairs at NORC at the University of Chicago. NORC is all about engagement, from effective media relations to making their research accessible to the public. Allison, tell us a bit about how you invite the public into your data.
I'm happy to do so. I'm so happy to be here. And as my colleagues on the panel have said, we've all learned so much from each other. So I hope those of you who are joining us today are enjoying this as well, because I'm having a blast. So first, just a sentence or two about NORC. NORC at the University of Chicago is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and objective research institution. We've been around since 1941. And I think it was in one of the questions, our researchers have tended not to want to get out in front of the data and talk about it. They just want to deliver the data, and they're like, they say the data speaks for itself. Over the last few years, we have really leaned into empowering our researchers to own the data and the research and think of themselves as thought leaders. And we are building a pretty robust thought leadership program as part of our communicating data plan. Also, I think I just want to mention, we've also been leaning into this hunger for data and information that I think we've all been experiencing when you look at websites like Vox and 538, the Upshot, but also just even in the last 12 months with the coronavirus. I don't know about you, but I am obsessed with the maps and the charts in the New York Times about all the hotspots. And of course, with the election of were the polls right and what data was accurate or not accurate. So it's a great time to share your research and share your data. The public is hungry for it. And by the public, I mean basically any of our stakeholders, any of your stakeholders. So for us, it could, at NORC, it could be anyone from other researchers, academics, students, policymakers, elected officials. Journalists are very much our audience, as well as the general population. And alongside this, our organization is very much driven by a commitment to data transparency and data literacy. So we believe that the more data that we can put out in the world and make available to others, as well as give people tools to explore the data or to understand the data, the better we all are as a country and as citizens. So I am actually going to share my screen and show a few examples of some things that we've been doing at NORC that I think you'll all find interesting. And I'm going to start first. Oops, I have to move I have to just move something over. If any of you have ever taken a sociology class, you have probably come across one of our best known data collection projects. It's called the General Social Survey, or the GSS. It is a survey of Americans' attitudes and perceptions on a whole range of topics, from extramarital affairs to confidence in institutions, pretty appropriate for the current climate. And the data has been collected since 1972. There have been periods of time where it's been collected annually, and now we're on an every other year cycle of collecting this data. So it's tremendous. We have a large number of researchers and journalists who wait for the day that the newest round of data is released. And by wait, I mean we release it at a particular time, and within an hour, we see that their stories and their downloads of the data. This data gets used in a variety of different ways, and it's really interesting and important data. So we created something that we call the GSS Data Explorer. And that's what you're looking at right now. It's a web-based tool that allows folks, if you're to download the data and explore it, to create projects, to save it. So you could be an academic or a graduate student. You could just be you or me and be interested in this. And if you're a real data person, you can go ahead and download those raw files, those raw data files, and knock yourself out. But if you're like me, you probably just want to know what are the top trends. So we created a key trends feature. And again, this is all from the data. Here, I picked this beforehand. So I picked a question under politics, confidence in the Supreme Court, because that's been in the news this year. So the question was basically, how much confidence do you have in the Supreme Court? And here, what you can look at is over time, people's confidence level in the Supreme Court. You can actually see the actual text for the question, because as those of us work in research know that how the question is asked, the wording of the question can also be very interesting. And then their notes. So again, this could be both for the expert, but also for the general public. And of course, for a journalist, a great way to explore some of really important data. The next thing I want to show you is the drug overdose. We call it the opioid death tool, but it's a tool that takes publicly available data about opioid deaths and misuse throughout the United States at a county by county level. Now, the story here is that the first map that we did that looked at opioid misuse data was done in partnership with one of our clients' partners, the Appalachian Regional Commission. And that tool was just focused on Appalachia. And it was looking at where, primarily like where there were overdoses, how did that connect to injuries? Did it connect to poverty levels? That received so much attention and was deemed so useful that the USDA Rural Commission came to us and said, let's do this for the whole country. And so what you can see, and I'm sorry, I seem to have lost my mouse. So I'm gonna, there we are. You can dive into this. Look, you can look at a county and you can really dig in. Again, this is publicly available data. We did it, so we had our folks work on this and it was funded by the USDA Rural Commission. So it's another way to get information out, especially to policymakers, elected officials, people who are trying to figure out how do we combat what's happening in our country, in our world, in our state. So that's another way you can do it. So those are two different approaches into the data. And then lest you think that everything takes a whole lot of money and a whole lot of expertise and designers, this morning, we just released our latest AmeriSpeak Spotlight on release. And what these are a series of quick hit, topical, self-funded, we fund these ourselves, research releases. We don't even do a report. We basically write a press release. Our researchers come up with the questions. We make sure that we think the questions, or we discuss whether or not the questions actually are germane to topics of interest that are out there in the world right now, because our whole goal here is to get attention in the media for these topics so that NORC gets to position ourselves as a source of reliable and timely data. This is our third annual flu vaccine quick study. And as you can see here, National Influenza Vaccination Week is next week. We put this out into the field. And then here's where I said it's pretty simple. It's essentially, this is it. It's a press release. We do have some graphics. They're static. They're not the fancy ones that I showed you before, but they get right to the heart of the questions that are on many people's minds about flu vaccinations. And right now, although, as I said, we've done this every year for this is our third year because it's very topical. It's even more topical this year because of all the discussion out in the media and the world about COVID vaccines and comorbidity and how that might influence flu flu vaccinations. So that's another example of something pretty straightforward, pretty easy, that you can do. So 3 different ways to engage different kinds of audiences. We promote all of these on social. Had it not been for the pandemic, the overdose tool, that's this one, would have had an event on the Hill and a briefing with the USDA as the host. But unfortunately, the pandemic came into play and we didn't get to do that. So that's, those are like my big things. Make your data as available and accessible as possible, whether that's just giving people the raw data or putting it in a form that people can play with themselves, or give them graphics that help them understand what the main takeaways are from the data. Of course, always partnering with our researchers to make sure that we're not misrepresenting anything.
That's
Thanks.
terrific, Allison. If any of you haven't spent time on NORC's website, I encourage you. Chapin Hall considers NORC our kind of big sister in the research field and in the research communication. And they're just a wonderful model for how to do it right. So we've taken you on a journey from the building trust with researchers and the evidence base, the research base for doing communication, to effective planning, to crafting messaging, to engaging audiences. And so now we want to engage you. So I'm going to hand it back over to Sean to moderate some Q&A.
We have a couple of questions and a little bit of time left, so let's get to as many of these as we can. Our first one comes from, and it's been, the other thing is, not only can you put your questions in, gang, in the Q&A box, but you can vote for the questions you want to hear. So first one comes from Ryan's got a vote. He says, how do you find and build relationships with journalists who might be interested in the work you are trying to share? So how might you do that? Anyone want to take a swing at that one? Building relationships with journalists in particular.
I'm happy to try to start us off. So I think, you know, it's knowing, like, communications is knowing your audience. And I think with journalists, it's the same thing. If you have, I would usually base it around specific reports. So if I had, you know, a childcare report or a women's labor force participation report, I would go to the reporters who have been covering that in depth and begin the relationship. I think one thing with research that is very effective is doing is pitching reporters ahead of your release. So you do embargo, you send them the report under embargo, and you say, you know, like a week beforehand, here's the report, it's embargoed until X time, X date. You know, let me know what you think of it. Let me know if you want to talk to one of the authors about it. And then they have sort of that advance notice, and they can write a release, or they can, not a release, they can write a story about it ahead of the release.
Yeah, Ryan, I'm going to jump in. In a prior life, I worked in think tank land, so I had a little experience here. What I would tell you is, if you're trying to build a relationship with a journalist around a particular tactical thing, like you're getting out a report or something, that's going to be hard. What you really want to try to do, and it's probably a challenge in the pandemic, is you want to build relationships, right? So the ideal is, it's actually sort of a beautiful symbiotic relationship where hopefully journalists who are covering the beats of the issues you're working on are telling you what they're interested in. They're sharing information that may be valuable to you and your organization. And at the same time, you're regularly sometimes feeding them information, sometimes even redirecting them. You may not have the answer to the question, but you become a valuable resource or source to them where they can find things when they're frequently working on deadline. And as we all know in the news business, increasingly working with really limited resources, right? So I don't think it's a matter of, maybe if you're being strategic about this, you think, what are the top 5 or 10, or maybe not more than 12 outlets that you really need to have relationships with, that sort of are the metrics of success for your organization, and then reach out to the reporters. I mean, I, even in a further life, worked at ABC News and CNN. Reporters want to have sources. They will welcome people who are reaching out, trying to be helpful to them, as long as they understand that there's not a quid pro quo, that it's a true relationship. And there'll be times when you're able to pass information you might want a piece on. They might be able to help, but by and large, it's about relationship building. Let's get to the next question. Janet Fershine says, could you share the link to the NORC press release on the flu vaccine? So it's a little bit more of a tactical thing. Allison, do you have that? And could you possibly put that into the chat for us?
Yes.
Wonderful. And then other questions, and you'll see, gang, we put all of the links in here, these tips into a Google Doc, and so you'll find those in the chat as well. But other questions as they may come in. Maybe I could put this question out on behalf of everybody to the group, because as I said, I've had a little experience here myself. What's the single biggest pain point for each of you? Maybe we could do this as sort of like Final Jeopardy, really fast. Allison, what's the single biggest challenge you run into on the daily in your work with researchers and getting their work out into the world?
Timing. I think we are always bouncing between the really thoughtful, well-planned, in advance strategic release, and the one that pops up where we get an email at 10 o'clock at night that says, oh, by the way, my client is doing a press event or releasing this press release and the final report with, you know, some big thing happening tomorrow at 9 a.m. Should we do anything with that? And you never want to say no, but it's really always that it's timing. How do we juggle? We do 400 projects a year. We do not do big releases for all 400. We probably do a couple a month that are really meaningful, and it's balancing all that stuff coming at us.
Marianne, what about you? Single biggest pain point?
I think the toughest communication piece is that most research isn't newsworthy. You know, it's interesting to a set of people who are studying the thing. It becomes a background point for journalists, but it's not a headline. So that's been my biggest adjustment as a communicator, is just accepting that and targeting my audience much more specifically than the media.
Emily, what about you? Single biggest pain point?
I think trying to figure out how your very small, this kind of piggybacks on what Marianne said, but how your very small piece of the puzzle fits in with the larger messages out there. And so trying to figure out, if you're just releasing a study, how that has to do with the whole larger discussion, and really kind of realizing that one study in and of itself isn't going to move anything.
Jennifer, same question to you.
Jennifer's.
There's two of us. But
Oh, that's right, there are two Jennifers. Let's go by alphabetical order. So Jennifer Amdor Spitz, and then.
I think, piggybacking on what Emily said, I think a lot of times there's expectations around research that, because I work for clients, that you're kind of managing those expectations, and then, helping the client understand that they're trying to make an impact in the world with that research, and it may not be the whole study that's valuable, but a piece of it that can really advance the conversation, and kind of pivoting from that, this is my baby, I want to deliver it to the world, to what is it about that baby that's going to make the impact you want to have, and helping them craft that strategy instead.
Jennifer, what about you? Sounds like you've had your fair share along the way.
Yeah, I think my biggest one, and this was a question that was in the chat, so I'll even answer it as part of that, is researchers who really want to who love the details of their research, and who are not convinced about the need to pull out the highlights or to do the plain language aspect of it. And so my workaround for that, or what I've done, and this could get me kicked out of Communications Network, maybe it's not good best practice, but is that I've done both. So like if there's a report that's 50 pages or 65 pages and I cannot get them to narrow the focus or to make the findings more effective in any way, I put a highlights page at the front of it that does what I need it to do. And I know that most of, like 95% of people are only going to read that page, 98% maybe. And then, their biggest fight that I would have are these like figure headers. They would want to have like the earnings ratio between men and women aged 18 or older in the United States, 2018. That would be like the title of a chart. And I would just say, can we just say gender wage gap? Like, can we just say that? So having like a big header that's for me and a smaller header that's for them has been effective because, you know, they have a point that if their report is going to also be used by people who are researchers, they need a certain amount of information, but I need and other people need this other kind of information in order to understand it.
Last question goes to Janet, who comes back. She says, jumping on the point Emily made, how do you help researchers then talk not only about their research, but also be able to speak broadly about research related to the topic so they can not only link up the science to the issue, but help to lift up solutions and show impact? Right now, there is so much demand for scientists and research to speak on COVID-related issues. How do you effectively help your research stand out beyond their own work as an expert?
Well, they all do reviews of literature every time they do work. So most researchers are pretty broadly familiar with the work in their field, and that makes them, more effective as sources. And, one other tip I just want to get in here is that there was an academic study, I'm going to look for it, that positively correlated presence on Twitter with the frequency with which the researcher's research is cited in other people's papers. Now, most researchers don't care that much about Twitter, but they care very much about their number of citations in other papers. And so there's been real evidence created that correlates social media with academic citations.
Oh, Marianne, I need that. I need that.
Yep.
So I hope this has been a useful hour for everyone who's been with us. Thank you for making the time. We know you all have a lot going on. We hope everybody had a safe and restful and healthy Thanksgiving. We're going to leave it there. I will say one thing we didn't talk about, which we know is important, is the manner in which you release research, right? So many of us are tempted to put this out in PDF. And as I think most of you all know, machines can't read PDFs because they're effectively photographs of data and information. So if you're looking for that researcher, let's make something up, a researcher in Stockholm is looking for a data set that happens to exist at NORC in Chicago. And NORC doesn't do this, by the way, but if you did, and they leave it on a PDF, they'll never find it. Because if you just put in basic Google search and ask for stuff, Google only sees what machines can read. So if you're posting in PDF, you are doing your audience a huge disservice. It's another thing for us to talk about. And we'll share that. I think we did a webinar on that some time back. So we'll talk to you a little bit more about that later. Thank you to everybody for making some time. Huge thanks to Marva for the ASL interpretation and to Alan for closed captioning. We'll be back again with Kevin Nguyen, as we said, coming up very soon. So look in your inbox for that. For now, please be safe and well, and we'll talk to you all very, very soon. Thanks, everybody. And thanks to everybody for joining us and leading this session. Alice and Marianne, the two Jennifers, Emily, and to all of you. Be well, safe and well. See you.
Thanks for coming.